Alright, we finally arrived to part 7 of 7, which on completion will signal the end of this series on the argument from consciousness. So as a quick review, please remember that several important definitions examples in the main inductive argument was detailed in the first video. So for clarification on the topic, if you are confused, see that video. Also, parts 2 through 6 dealt with the inductive version of the argument from consciousness, which concluded that 1. Given 3 popular hypotheses of human consciousness, substance dualism seemed to be the least internally problematic vis-a-vis objections, or at the least it answers its internal and external problems well. And 2, given 3 criteria theory acceptance, substance dualism seems to be the only hypothesis to meet all 3 criteria, and thus is acceptable. Now here in part 7, I wish to supplement the inductive argument by presenting a deductive form of the argument that you guys can chew through and argue over, since these are easier to look at than inductive arguments. I'm going to be following J.P. Moreland's formulation in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, as well as his 2009 work, I think it's Consciousness, a Theistic Argument is the title. It is my contention that the argument that Moreland uses is valid and true and correctly ascribes mental events to God. Now I'd quickly like to survey the premises of the argument. Premise 1 indicates that there are such things as mental events and they exist non-physically. Now interestingly, many naturalists who reject the argument from consciousness still accept that mental events exist, thus premise 1. For example, John Searle does and Colin McGinn. Yet these same naturalists object to any subsequent premises from the argument from consciousness. So they accept the first premise, but they object anything subsequently following from it. However, as argued previously in the first 6 videos, I think the events in question cannot be reduced to physical processes of the brain due to the uniqueness of the events, which contain qualities that physical events do not have, and via the indiscernibility of identicals are not the same events. So concisely, premise 1 has strong backing by skeptics and by the inherent qualities of mental events themselves. We could also offer such arguments as the knowledge argument or modal arguments, but for the sake of time I haven't done that. And so you can look up those on your own. Premise 2 states that there are correlations between physical and mental events. For example, there's a correlation between sensory brain states from a pinprick and the mental subjective awareness of the individual being quote-unquote in pain. Or consider the correlation between a mental act of volition to the brain state of motor planning, to move the arm. It is here at premise 2 where one will hear 2 common objections against mind-body interaction, and damage to the brain is evidence that the mental events are dependent on brain events. However, as discussed in part 5, the objector would be hard-pressed to establish dependence versus correlation. Dependence is in no way clear comparatively to the correlation between the 2 states. Premise 3 states that there is an explanation to these correlations, and like premise 6 that I'll describe in a second here, this premise is defended through the video series. So for specific arguments for the support of this premise, you'll have to look at the first 6 videos. Now I touched on premise 4 in part 5 implicitly, so allow me a little more detail to this premise. The main justification for premise 4 is the difference between libertarian and event-causal theories of agency. An intentional volitional act brought about by a free agent does not seem to square with a naturalistic epistemology, grand story, or ontology. For example, given that a person P brings about E as a result of his intention J to bring E, is this intention something which he may just find himself having, or rather, something which in some way he must choose to have? If the latter, then we are still left with personal bringing about. If the former, it is possible that the intention might cause E without the agent having in any way intentionally brought E about. One may find himself having an intention to raise his arm, but be too reluctant, hesitant, or shy to act on his intention. Nevertheless, we can assume or suppose that the intention could suddenly cause E to the agent's surprise without his intentionally having raised his arm. So bringing an effect intentionally is not just a matter of an intention bringing about the effect. Therefore, personal explanation is unique and is not reducible to scientific explanation. This is a quote by Swinburne in his 1993 book. So in other words, based on human experience, I think what Swinburne is trying to say is we don't find ourselves having intentions to do X against our wills, which force us to perform some action as puppets. Thus, although scientific explanations often explain the occurrence of operation of the factors involved in personal explanation, like the flexing of the muscles to lift objects, personal explanation is still the explanation. The flower pot was placed in front of the house by Jim. Now, premise 5 states that an explanation should either be scientific or personal. I think it is safe to say that without any compelling thought experiments or examples to the contrary, a personal theistic explanation or a naturalistic explanation would exhaust most of the live options for explanation that exist. So if anyone has any thoughts contrary to this point, let me know. It would be a very interesting debate or discussion. Premise 6 states that the explanation for the correlations between the mental and physical events is not naturalistic in nature. This point has been argued from video 1 to video 6, and thus, much like premise 3, the support for this premise can be found in the aforementioned videos. So it's not begging the question, there was arguments provided, they just aren't in this video. So please take a look at that. Now, premise 7 follows from premise 5 and 6 if they are true, so that leads us to premise 8, which says if the explanation is personal, then it's theistic. Now, obviously, certain objections can be raised here about whether the explanation must be theistic. Why couldn't the deity involved be pantheistic in nature, etc.? But note a few things here. First, it could be persuasively argued that deism and pantheism are in no way personal, but rather are very much impersonal by their very natures. Second, following J.P. Moreland's conclusion on the matter, he says, quote, "These issues would be intramural theistic problems of small comfort to someone like Cyril, committed to naturalism. Moreover, if we take live options only, then it seems fair to limit our alternatives in 5 to theistic or naturalistic explanations," end quote. Hence, I'd like to add to this premise that it holds strong probability in its favor if you use it in cumulative arguments. Thus, if these premises hold, we arrive at the conclusion. Therefore, the explanation of mental-physical correlations is theistic. I think personally that I prefer to argue for dualism via the inference of the best explanation via an inductive nature of the arguments, but the deductive arguments help clarify specific areas of contention. So there you go. That ends the series. Thanks for watching.